This is 27, Boccaccio and Chaucer. We are now squarely in the Renaissance. We begin in Florence, where we were with Petrarch yesterday, and then we continue into England as this Renaissance spirit spreads there. Chaucer was very influenced by Boccaccio. They knew each other, they were friends, and in both of them we see this format of a bunch of tales, sort of that we saw in Ovid also. But in this case, most of the tales are about ordinary people, not necessarily these nobles and heroes in the classical sense. So we have the classical world's interest in things of this world, but also with everyday people. Now let's talk first about Boccaccio's Decameron. Obviously, we have this context of the plague, and we have this rather grand preface about the plague. And it's somewhat interesting, and I think you guys responded to that as a kind of effective narrative setup. It holds your interest. We compare Boccaccio to Petrarch in one way. If you remember, Petrarch had said that fierce love troubled him in his youth, but then when he got to be 40, he swore off women, and this made him very happy. Well, we hear Boccaccio say very much the same thing. He says, "Now I live free of love, because," he said, "from my earliest youth up to the present, a most exalted noble love had inflamed me. I found it painful to endure, because its fire never allowed me to rest. While I suffered, the pleasant conversation and invaluable consolation of certain friends gave me such relief that I remain absolutely convinced that they prevented my death." This goes back to, if you recall, during the section on the Crystal Cave in Tristan, where we were told that the way to love is very dangerous. This way to the Crystal Cave is surrounded by boulders, and it's extremely dangerous. This is the idea that love can actually cause death, because these people are getting so into love, and it's becoming, in a way, a kind of romantic religion, that when you do not obtain the object of your desire, you are completely miserable. And this is why Petrarch has sworn off love, and this is why Boccaccio has sworn off love. And yet at the same time, here Boccaccio is giving us these tales of love. There was a very interesting note there that I want to talk about regarding women, where Boccaccio says, "Restrained by the desires, whims, and commands of their fathers, mothers, brothers, and husbands, most of the time women remain pent up within the narrow confines of their rooms. And as they sit there in apparent idleness, both yearning and not yearning at the same time, the varied thoughts they mull in their minds cannot always remain happy ones. If because of those thoughts a fit of melancholy brought on by their burning desire should take possession of their minds, it will inevitably remain there, causing them great pain unless removed by new interests." And he contrasts this situation of women to that of men, saying, "Men do not lose everything to love." In other words, men have all these careers and events and affairs in the world to preoccupy them, but since women don't have careers, what else do they have to think about but love? Especially since they are dependent upon men to marry them and have children with them, and women cannot really make the first move. So what Boccaccio says he's doing with this book is to offer help to women who are sort of sitting around with nothing to do and think about, pining for men that they haven't yet met or with whom they have not yet built lives. He says, "I offer here a refuge for ladies in love. The rest can make do with their needles, their spindles, and their wool winders." In other words, he's saying that if you're a woman who's interested in more than what's going on in your crappy little life, this book is for you. Ladies will derive not only pleasure from the entertaining material, but useful advice as well. For the stories will teach them how to recognize what they should avoid, and likewise what they should pursue. Now, for all that, the stories don't seem to me to have a strong moral element. They have, at best, fables, and actually somewhat ironic fables. And when we get to the first one, we will see there a sort of critical attitude developing toward the church, and this is new, and it points forward toward the Reformation. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about this section on day 1, where they're talking about how in the year 1348 these people left Florence because of the plague. How many valiant men, how many beautiful women, how many lovely youths dined in the morning with their families, companions, and friends, only to have supper that evening with their ancestors in heaven or hell. So, in the setup for the first tale of the Decameron, the ladies tell themselves, we should go to where the birds sing, where the wheat fields wave in the wind. This worship of a rural life is a new note that we're finding in Europe. We didn't really see people celebrating the beauty of the countryside. Now people from the city are rediscovering the countryside, also as they are rediscovering the rural verses of poets like Virgil and Horace, who celebrated the virtues of country life as they left Rome for their country villas. Now, let's just talk a little bit more about the attitude toward women here, which seems a little misogynist. One of the ladies herself says in this group who are about to leave the city because of the plague, she says, women, when left to themselves in a group, can get quite irrational. Without a man to look after them, they become terribly disorganized. And then one of the other girls says, true, without a man to guide us, only rarely does anything we do succeed. So we can see how women are presented in a certain sense as a problem requiring liberation, but all of the solutions for their liberation involve men taking over and telling them what to do. So we arrive in this rural villa, and we can tell that we're squarely in female sensibility here when we are told servants had swept the palace clean, made up the beds, and decorated each room with seasonal flowers. They walk out through the gardens, they make garlands of various types of foliage for one another, and sing songs of love. Again, these are not traditional masculine activities like hunting and so forth. This is a lady's book. Let's go to the first story. Abraham the Jew goes to the court of Rome. We hear as a moral put forward here the idea of integrity, which is one of our great Western ideas. The teller of the tale says, I tell this story in the hope that we will all better put what we believe into practice. And of course, the basic twist or premise of the story is that the life of Christians in Rome, and by extension all of Europe probably, is so scandalous and so far from the ideals of Jesus that for the religion to continue at all, God must want it to happen, because otherwise, why wouldn't it just collapse? So therefore, this Jew takes it as evidence that God does favor the Christian faith, simply because without God's intervention, how could this corrupt structure possibly continue and thrive? Let's look a little bit more closely about this attitude toward the church, in which we find the beginnings and the stirrings of a critical spirit toward Christianity, and particularly toward the church and the people who run the church and the people who have supposedly devoted their lives to Christ. This Jew Abraham, he goes to Rome, and there he soon learned that all the priests committed the sin of lust, not just the natural variety, but also the homosexual and prostitutional, such that the influence of whores and boys obtained great favors from them. Besides this, he saw clearly the clergy as all gluttons, drunks, and sots, who, like true beasts, served their bellies more than anything else except for their lust. On closer inspection, he also saw the priests as so greedy and money-grubbing that they would as readily buy and sell the blood of Christians as sacred objects. So here we definitely find the beginnings of what in a couple hundred years will turn into the Reformation. In other words, the idea of purity. Jesus said that we should be as pure as God, and clearly the leaders of the church, the participants in this structure of Christendom, the bureaucrats, from top to bottom, according to this Jew, and really according to Boccaccio, it's pretty bad, right? It's pretty bad. And so the idea of reforming this becomes an implicit possibility. Once you acknowledge that there's a problem, then the question becomes, how do we solve this? Now, Abraham the Jew solves it by converting to Christianity because he sees the continued thriving of the faith as evidence of God's will. But when we get to Martin Luther in a couple of hundred years, the problem will be solved by an attempt to destroy and certainly to break with the Catholic Church and create new independent churches, which in fact become pawns of their governments, but that's a whole separate story. Now let's move on to the story about the gardener and the nuns. In this story, we get the implicit idea of the liberation not only of women, but of the peasants. So with regard to the ladies, we're told regarding the people who keep them indoors with very little to do. These people never stop to think about the potent forces produced by idleness and confinement. And then, with regard to the peasants and people of the land, likewise, many believe wrongly that the hoe and the spade, coarse food, and hard living eliminate all romantic desires in those who work the land, making them dim-witted and unperceptive. So the idea is that there are these untapped energies regarding ordinary people who have been sort of kept down by these structures of feudal society of the Middle Ages, and now these are going to come loose because we see and we acknowledge that ordinary people, such as those who work the land or who are a handyman or a farmer, they too have romantic feelings, they too have reason, they're not just dim-witted, they're actually rather clever. And so we can become interested in their lives and follow their adventures in prose, and before long, actually politically, they will become interested in obtaining power. Now, this handyman who comes back from the convent complaining about his time there, he says to Massetto, who will become the hero of our story, all of these nuns had the devil inside them because no matter what I did, it never suited them. Sometimes when I worked in the vegetable garden, one of them would say, put this here, and another would say, put that there, and yet a third would snatch the hoe from my hand and tell me, you're doing it all wrong. They'd make themselves such a pain that I'd stop working and leave the garden. Now this to me strikes a comic note and a rather true and universal note that men tend to feel toward women when they make comments or they sort of henpeck while men are trying to get stuff done. This is an old and a continuing kind of sentiment from a man's point of view creeping in here. But one of the interesting things in this text is that even though it's written for women and includes many women's points of views, it also includes male voices. So this is more like a festival or a carnival of a bunch of different voices and points of view. And this also is a new note. Particularly, again, the new note here is that the characters are drawn from life. And this anecdote about the handyman complaining about the women henpecking him seems drawn from life. It seems actually drawn from the experience of the author or his own observations about the world and how the world works. This is rather new. Let's look at another character drawn from real life that we haven't really met in the Middle Ages, and that is the character of the ladies' man, who will appear in a lot of these stories of Boccaccio and also of Chaucer. Massetto lived as what we would call a ladies' man, and he liked to kiss lots of different women without giving his heart to just one. So Massetto goes to the convent and he initiates this sort of elaborate charade in which he pretends to be a deaf mute so that he believes the nuns will be less apprehensive about hiring him and won't suspect his goals, and in fact that turns out to be the case. As Massetto worked there day after day, the nuns started pestering him and making fun of him, just as some do with deaf mutes. This also strikes a note of realism. It's the way people behave. Now let's talk about what actually happens in this story, which is that this handyman, Massetto, kisses all these nuns, and no one really cares. There's no moral judgment pronounced on this. It's not considered sinful, as it would have been in Dante, as Dante would have depicted these people in hell being punished. Here it's all rather merry. It's all rather a festival or a carnival of human passions, and we see the comedy in it, and it's actually somewhat like Seinfeld. Now let's go on to Chaucer, in which this idea of things that are sort of amoral or non-moral or no judgment being pronounced becomes a real thing. Now, as I noted, many consider Chaucer the father of English literature because he's the first named author to really write in English and produce what we think is really good stuff. One of the things that's regarded as good stuff is the prologue of the Canterbury Tales, and let's look at that in terms of how the setting here establishes the values of these stories. When April with sweet showers has pierced dry March, and small birds that sleep all the night with open eyes begin to sing, then do folk long to go on pilgrimages, and pilgrims seek strange strands, the shrines of distant saints. So what do we see there? We certainly see the earth and the natural seasons and nature front and center. And we see people responding to nature and in a sort of synchronized way with nature in spring, going out for adventures, which they call pilgrimages, which are really an attempt to embrace experience by doing new things and going to strange lands. So the narrator finds himself in this inn and he hooks up with some other pilgrims who were going on a pilgrimage to shrines, to pray in shrines, but really they see this whole thing as an excuse to travel, to get out of the house, to get some fresh air, to tell stories, and to laugh about the human condition in a way which we might call ribald. Ribald means a joyous sort of celebration of human foibles, particularly with regard to things like having sex. But another note in Chaucer especially strikes me as new, and that's this idea of portraits that are almost photographic of ordinary people. With regard to the miller who tells us this first tale, he wore a beard as white as a shovel and red as a fox. Upon the top of his nose perched a wart sprouted with hairs. This is a realism about people. We have never seen in the Middle Ages, or even in the ancient world, as far as I know, a close-up on a wart that's sprouting hairs. Now let's consider this character of Nicholas the student. Like the character we just read about in Boccaccio, Misetto, Nicholas also knew of forbidden love and how to give satisfaction to the ladies. So he is a ladies' man. Again, this character is recurring and becoming a standard type. Now with regard to this carpenter, John, he had never read the ancient Roman Cato's maxim that every man should wed his like, a man should marry a woman of similar condition, for youth and age will often quarrel. But since love's snare trapped him, he had to endure his predicament like any other man. In fact, John has to endure a lot, and this is one of the questions that comes up for me. Why were not these people at the time sort of bothered by what seems to me a note of cruelty in the story? Now, we are led to believe that John basically mistreated this woman and that they were a mismatch and he was jealous and didn't give her freedom. And the idea seems to be that he sort of just should have let her play around and said, oh, what's the big deal? She's going to have affairs. When he doesn't act that way, complications develop. Now, this woman, Allison, has many admirers, and one of them is a clerk called Absalom. He notices her in church. Again, this idea that beneath Christianity, there lurks a lot of sensuality. So in church, this clerk Absalom notices Allison. Now let's look at the description of this clerk. His curly gold head spread out upon his head like a broad fan. He wore elegant red stockings, and he had the skills of a surgeon, a barber, and a notary. He could jig and dance in 20 styles, and he could play the fiddle and strum the guitar, and he liked to flirt with all the saucy barmaids and all the bars of Oxford. But he showed himself somewhat squeamish about passing gas, and in like ways seemed quite proper and fastidious. So, for whatever reason, we now get the idea of passing gas in these stories. The fascination with human bodily functions and processes and things we've never really talked about. We also get the voice of Petrarch or of Boccaccio, or also Chaucer apparently sides with this idea that love is dangerous for men. Lo, what a powerful thing, emotion. Men may die of imagination, so profoundly can a feeling afflict the mind. Again, this idea going back to the crystal cave, that love is dangerous and deadly. So all these complications develop, and one of the things is that Absalom comes to the window of Allison to try and woo her, even as she's cheating on her husband with this other fellow, this student Nicholas. Then we get all this stuff regarding people's fannies being stuck out of windows, and first being kissed, and then being branded with hot irons. This is definitely something that we did not see in Beowulf or in Dante. In fact, just could not have been there by any stretch of the imagination. So here we see people's tushies being stuck out of windows and stuff being done to them, and this is considered funny, and it is rather funny. This Nicholas passed a huge amount of gas, a blast that almost blinded Absalom. But again, the note here that really strikes me is how this seems like Seinfeld. We get characters who remind me of Newman. They do stuff that's rather scandalous, and they're scoundrels, and yet they're interesting. No one would want to be like them, but they're interesting to spend time with for a little while. And we also see something like Seinfeld in the way all the plot threads come together at the end when John cuts himself down from the rafters because someone yells water, water to try and soothe the man's branded butt. And John thinks that this water refers to the flood, and so he cuts himself down from the ceiling and he falls. This reminds me very much of Seinfeld, the way all the threads tend to come together at the end, producing a huge comic resolution. Now, in the end, even though John, the cuckolded husband, is treated rather cruelly, none of the people in the story seem to mind this at all. They all think it's rather funny. Everyone made merry at all this strife. Thus lived the carpenter's wife despite all John's keeping and jealousy. Thus did Absalom kiss Alison's bottom. Thus too Nicholas burned his own butt. God save us all. So this is the world of the Renaissance. Again, it's a huge carnival of humans and the things they do, not all of which are noble at all. In fact, we're seeing a much broader canvas here that's opening up whole areas of human activity for investigation, for celebration, for commentary, and for perhaps liberation and reform. The idea is that women and ordinary people are worth thinking about, their perspectives are worth considering, they're worth celebrating, they're worth reconstructing in literature and prose, and because of that, there will be political consequences, as we discover in succeeding centuries.